hyphen symbol, and time is separated. Time, that means hours, minute, and second, are separated with columns. But in case of timestamp, these symbols that are doing separation are not there. You can store the data time without any kind of separation among these values. Okay, so it will take obviously less time. Okay, and it will be easy to process them also. Okay,
सर
so
यू सर
yeah,
सर यूज
yeah.
के हिसाब से सर दोनों का डिफरेंस बताइए सर।
uh, नो, इसमें कोई खास डिफरेंस नहीं है जनरली। टाइम स्टाम्प जो है, हम जनरली टाइम स्टाम्प को ज़्यादा यूज करते हैं, डेटा टाइम को नहीं करते हैं। डेटा टाइम will take much space. So use में as such difference नहीं है. If you need to store the data time in this format, you can do this. Here actually, if you want to separate date and time, that is that give you good separation. Okay. When you want to show data time in a particular column, that will give you good separation between date and time. You can see this way. But here everything will be written in a kind of sequence, so it will not go good separation. So where you want to provide good separation or kind of good user interface, you can go for data time. Okay, but if you do not want to have a good separation among these, you just need to record the times. So generally this data time timestamp is used for system related events that are occurring in the system, because this reading you can retrieve directly from your system. Every operating system have provisions that records date and time. Okay, so they record actually timestamp, so you can retrieve that timestamp from their system clock directly. So these values can be stored directly there. So system clock से जो value directly अगर आपको store करना है, so then timestamp is more suitable for that. But if you just want to record the date and a particular time of a particular event, like some user event, not system events, then you can go for this format. ओके, सो जनरली सिस्टम रिलेटेड जो इवेंट्स होती हैं, इंटरनल इवेंट्स सिस्टम की, मे बी सॉफ्टवेयर की भी समटाइम्स इंटरनल इवेंट्स हो सकती हैं, यू कैन यूज दिस टाइम स्टैम्प. Okay, so timestamp is preferred when the things related to system events or application events are there. You can go for timestamp. But user related events hai, your user data related events hai, and then you should use date and time also. Okay, so okay, there is no much how much different, there is not very much difference among them, but they have different kind of applications actually. Here you are just directly reading the value of system clock actually. Hmm? And then storing date and timestamp. You can also have a you can define timestamp as a data type as well. So आपको इसकी value provide नहीं करना है. MySQL will automatically take that value for that. You just read the value from system clock and then store that value. Okay. So आपको manually store करना है, then you can go for it. If you want to take this value automatically, you can go for timestamp. Okay, so for example, suppose you want to store a time of the records insertion, you can go for timestamp.
Sir,
Okay, so now if suppose you want to year only, because if you go for date, you have to store year, month, and date. But suppose if you want to store only the year, then you have this data type, year m, where m specifies how much digit you will require. So either you can use 2-digit format or 4-digit format. So in 2-digit format, you will use only last 2 digits of the year, like 2022. So you will just store 22, not 2000. Or you can go for 4-digit format. So 2022, like this, you will store the date. So it depends which data type suits your requirement. Okay, so these are the data types that are supported by MySQL. We have not discussed all all data types. There are some more data types that I already told you that there are some special data types that are used to handle geographical data and location related data. And you also have JSON data type that is used to store data in JSON format. Okay, so those formats and data types are actually out of scope of our syllabus, so that's we are not discussing them here. Okay, now we have seen all these things already, and let me come to Privileges we will not discuss right now. Integrity constraints we also will not discuss. Hmm. Not the for create table command. Okay, चलिए integrity constraints डिस्कस करते हैं because I don't have separate slides for discussing uh, create tables or table commands. Hmm. Now let's talk about integrity constraints. We have already talked about these constraints in our theory classes, so I will not go much into very much detail, but I will just give you some overview for sake of completeness. So as you already know, integrity constraints are the rules or constraints or regulations that you impose on a database to make or to make database or uh, to specify conditions related to consistency requirement of your database. Okay, many times actually why these conditions are required, actually what happens many times when you are inserting data or you are modifying the data, you may enter a data or the value or some values that are not as per the requirements or the consistency requirements related to the data. Okay, so for example, suppose let's take an example of instructor table. In case of instructor table, we have that we have provision that instructor id should be unique, right? Or and similarly one instructor can have only one department. That was also constraint that we have seen in our table. uh, this halaki this constraint can be different in different scenario, but for the time being, for simplicity, let's assume that we know that instructor id is unique. So now you should not be able to insert a record that uh, is having an instructor id that is already there into the table, right? So this is a kind of consistency requirement, because you know that instructor IDs are unique. They are not duplicated. That means two instructors cannot have same IDs. Two different instructors cannot have same instructor ID. Okay, this is the requirement of for the creating the instructor ID. We have created instructor ID because we do not want that two instructors should have same ID, and with the help of instructor ID, we want to uniquely identify each of the instructor. We want to give a unique identity to every instructor. So obviously instructor ID cannot be duplicated. Okay, so so we require some restrictions, or we require to impose certain restrictions that database should always adhere to. Okay, so whenever somebody try to insert a instructor record that is having instructor id that is already included in database, so database should stop such kind of manipulation of the data or such kind of insertion of a record. Okay, so these kind of constraints that you imply or that you impose over the database to keep database in consistent state are called integrity constraints. So integrity constraints objective is to avoid any kind of accidental change. Okay, so I am saying that accidental change, sometimes user may be willing to enforce that change knowingly, जानबूझ करके वो change ऐसा करना चाहते हैं, that is going to lead into a inconsistent state. So दोनों केसेस को आपको रोकना है. एक तो accidental, unknowingly user is entering a value that is going to hamper the consistency of the database, है ना? Or knowingly somebody want to enter a record that want to that is that will hamper the consistency of the database. So दोनों ही केसेस को आपको रोकना है, so that your database will remain always remain in a consistent state. Inconsistency को आपको रोकना है, so that's why you require integrity constraint. So some example of integrity constraints may be like that. These constraints actually vary from one organization to organization. For example, suppose in some bank, you in a saving account you may require that minimum balance should be 1000. So any kind of transfer, you may say that, or you may say that any kind of transfer should not uh, uh, left the balance less than 1000. That may be the bank's policy कि आप इतना अमाउंट ट्रांसफर ना करें कि 1000 से कम अमाउंट बचे आपके अकाउंट में. You can stop such kind of modification into the database. Or Some in some bank it may be the case that they require that account should have minimum balance of 2000. Okay, so this is a kind of consistency requirement. Salary of an employee cannot be null. You cannot have a employee salary null. It should be some value. In some cases, in some organization may allow null, some organization may not allow null. So these kind of restrictions we need to impose. Marks of a student cannot be negative in a case where, in a case of an institution that doesn't allow negative marking. Okay, if an institute allows negative marking, then you can allow negative values. If negative marking is not there, then obviously marks of a student in a course cannot be negative. Right? So we need to impose these kind of constraints. So all these constraints are imposed in with the help of integrity constraints. So we will see them one by one. So these are the some of the integrity constraints that you can impose on your database. First is unique constraints. Okay, so this constraint is used to define candidate keys on a database. Now you know that we have two kind of keys on a database generally, primary key and unique key. So we have already seen in theoretical class we have different kind of different or more than two candidate keys in your database, or sometimes maybe maybe having only one, but we can have one or more candidate keys. And if we have more than one candidate key, we choose one key as the primary key, and remaining keys are referred as alternate keys. Okay, many times we may require to impose the candidate key also on your database. So if you want to impose candidate key on a database, you can apply that constraint with the help of unique constraint. So suppose in a table you are storing Aadhaar number of a person. Let's say student table is there where each student is having enrollment number, and you are also storing Aadhaar number of a student. Okay, and we want that Aadhaar number should be unique, because you know that Aadhaar number is not duplicated. No two different person can have same Aadhaar number. So obviously we would like to impose a restriction that Aadhaar number may be null, may be left, because somebody is not willing to give the Aadhaar number. But whenever Aadhaar number is given, it should be unique. So we can impose this restriction with the help of unique constraint. We will see that how we will apply a unique constraint. Then primary key constraint. So obviously this constraint is used to define primary key. Okay, we know that what is the role of the primary key in a database. We will see that how to define primary key. Then there is a kind of constraint that is called foreign key constraint. So foreign key constraint creates set subset dependency. What is the meaning of foreign key? That means a column of a table that is working as a primary key in other table. So such column is called foreign key in the it's in the table, and the other column that is working as a primary key in the other table will be called reference key with respect to this foreign key. Okay, so this foreign key and the reference key jointly creates a subset superset dependency. Okay, set subset dependency sometimes we call it. So which will be the superset? The key attribute that is working as a key in the table. So that attribute will be the superset, and the foreign key will behave as a subset. Okay, so now when you apply foreign key, as you already know, when we apply foreign key, so whenever you will do insertion in a foreign key column, the value that is being entered into the foreign key column will be verified whether this value is also available in the reference key or not. If it is so, then modification will be allowed. If it is not, if this is not so, modification will be stopped. This is your foreign key constraint. We will see that how we can specify foreign key constraint in MySQL. Then there are some other constraints that we want to want that our database to satisfy. For example, in case of university, we would like to have that students' marks cannot be negative. So, or in case of a bank, we may require that the account balance of the saving account cannot be, let's say, less than 5,000 or maybe 2,000. So these constraints that are specific to the business or specific to the organization are called business constraint. Okay, and these constraints are imposed with the help of check constraint. We will see them how to specify check constraint. Okay, then not null constraint, you already know. We may require in some cases that a particular column should not have null value. You should not skip this value for this column. So we can specify null constraint on that column. So once you specify null constraint on that column, no null value can be entered into particular column. So for example, in case of instructor table, you can keep not null constraint with the salary column. So now when you specify salary is not null, no null value will be there, or you cannot enter null value in the first column. Then there is a provision for specifying default value for a particular column. This is called a default constraint. Okay, so when we define a default value particular column, so sometimes it may be the case that we may not have the value for that column, or we would not like to give the value for that column. So the default value can be taken by the database automatically. So for example, suppose let's assume we define default salary value 40,000. So suppose we insert a record of an instructor and we don't give the salary for that instructor while inserting the record. Okay, so now database will automatically accept the default value for that column, and it will store the default value with that column in the salary column, in the salary column. Okay, now let's see these constraints one by one. Okay, so let me show you. We are having the MySQL file at some place. One minute. Hmm. So I think font is large enough, or I should enlarge the font. Mm, okay, where is the preferences? Font, favorite, content color. Twenty two before. Okay. Now I think it is large enough. So now let's see how to define a table in your database. So as I told you that in order to create a table, you you need to use create table command. Okay, and then the name of the table you need to specify. So create table classroom, and then within the brackets you need to specify the definition of the column. Okay, so call definition of the column have three things. First, name of the column, then data type of the column. So we are having varchar 15 data type for this column, and then third third value, as I told you, that is missing here. That is constraint if you want to specify on that column. Okay, like suppose you want to make it primary key, then you can make it primary key. Okay, if some attribute need to be defined as primary key, or you want to impose not null constraint here, you can just simply write not null. Okay, so this is how you can add, or you can give a definition of the column. So definition of a column, let me repeat again. Definition of a column have three things: name of the column, then data type of the column, and then any constraint if you want to specify. Okay, so I don't want to specify any constraint here, so I just remove it. So now in this table you have two things: building, room number, and there we are having a column capacity. That data type of is this is numeric. So this is again equivalent to decimal and 4,0. Okay, so the decimal, the range will be 4-digit number. This is actually up to 4-digit number, and we don't want any decimal point here. So that means that this capacity will be an integer value. Then this is another way to defining a constraint. So now we have defined primary key here in this table in this way. Primary key, and then you specify what are the attributes that are going to behave as the primary key in the table. Okay, so you will list them within the bracket. So building and room numbers are going to be primary key in this table. Okay, so this is one way. Now see this department table. We will come back to again this constraint actually. That's why I'm jumping on this table. So let's see this here we are defining a table named as department. So we have a table named as department, and columns are department name, varchar 20. Then we have building, that is data type is variable, varchar 15, and we have budget. Then this is the budget. Maximum 12 digits are allowed, and there are 2 digits for decimal point. So integer portion will have 10 digits, and a 2 will be for decimal point. And we are specifying a constraint here that budget should be greater than 0. So this constraint is called check constraint. Okay, this is how we can define a check constraint. So this is a business constraint actually. Okay, this kind of constraint. So business constraints are imposed with the help of check constraint. Now you see that we have defined primary key. So now you see that in this case primary key, when we are defining within the column, within the parenthesis, it is having only one column. So when your primary key is having only one column, so you can redefine this attribute like this, just like this, primary key. Okay, like this also. So let me just run this command for you on MySQL so that you will be able to understand. So first let me log into the database. Uh, I have given now password is okay. So let me just increase the font. Okay. So now when we log in, first we need to decide which database we need to work. So first if we want to, so we can see the list of the database using this command. So databases, we have already discussed this command. So this command will show you the databases, and we want to work with this database, university_db. So in order to select a database for working, you can use either connect command or use. So use university_db. Okay. So now I have selected this database for working. So with the help of show tables command, I can see list of all the tables. Okay. Now I want to define a set of tables or some tables. So let's just try to create this table. Uh, so let me just copy it and paste it. And I think pasting is not done properly. Let me cancel it. So let's redefine it by manually create table. So classroom table is I guess already there. So let me uh, rename this classroom 2 or 1. Okay. And now we can define, or we can give the definition of the columns. So in case of classroom table, what we are having, how many columns we are having? We have 3 columns: building, room number, and capacity. Okay, so let's see. So name of the column first we need to define building. So we can go for varchar, let's say 15, comma. And we have room number or room no. I just want to make it int, or tiny int we can say. space is there or not. See, I forgot space is there or not. Pinning, and then what was the other other attribute? Capacity. Sorry. Capacity. Let's say, or it can also be taken as pinning. And we can define primary key. So we will define primary key, and within the bracket we will specify what are the attributes that are going to behave as primary key. So in this case, building comma room number are going to become primary key. Okay, so I think we are done. Let's enter sum.
सर कैपेसिटी टिनी इंट के बाद सर एक कॉमा लगेगा, प्राइमरी की के पहले एक कॉमा लगेगा सर.
No, I think let me check. No, yes, we have forgot to add comma. Sorry. building building doesn't exist in the table. 1 minute. I think space है यहाँ. Some mistake is still there. Okay, so मैंने typing mistake की है. Building varchar room number tenant capacity tenant primary key building room number and so on. Till tiny int, what is saying near tiny int. So tiny int doesn't have space. Tiny int. Now table will be created. Okay, so this is the table that we have created. Now let's create table department. Create table department 1. And department table is already there, so we are going to create the table with different name. Department underscore name, and let's say varchar 40. Okay. Then we have building. Building, and let's say this is also varchar 20. And budget b to be at budget, and it can be, let's say, we want to have integer value in this budget, so let's make it int, and we can apply check constant there, or check budget greater than 0. Okay, now we can specify primary key here also, and just write primary key. Okay, department name is a primary key, so we can write primary key in this way also. Let's run this query. Semicolon. Okay, so this is also another way to define the primary key. Now you see that I have defined primary key here itself. Okay, just in front of the column. So actually, by this, what I'm trying to say that there are two kind of constraints that you can apply. When I define primary key in this way, then we say that we have defined primary key as a column constraint. Okay, when we define this like this, then we say that this is a table constraint. However, it doesn't matter how you define primary key, it will also function same in a same way. Okay, but actually when we define primary key this way, and this is possible only when your primary key is having single column. Okay, but if your primary key includes more than one column, then we have to define in this way, that means as a table constraint. Okay, so when your table is having only single column as the key, so you have two choices, either you can define in this way or you can define in this way, both will work. Okay, there is no issue, both will work. Okay, so you might have run this SQL file already, so you have confirmed this will also work. And if you don't specify, you remove this here and you just write primary key here, this will also work. Okay, so now you can observe that there are two ways using that you can define certain integrity constraints. You can define certain integrity constraint as column constraint, or certain integrity constraints can be defined as table constraints only. And certain constraints are there, they can be defined in both the ways. You can define them column constraint as and also as table constraints. Okay. Okay, so now let's come to this slides. Now, as I told you that you can define keys in two ways, column constraints, or you can classify your constraints into two ways, column constraints and table and column constraints, or table constraint actually. So column constraints कौन से constraints हैं? Not null constraint. Not null constraint always need to define with in front of the column. Like suppose you want that building name should be not null, then you have to write not null here, not null. Okay, you cannot define not null constraint in this way. Okay, you have to define with the column also, column only. Okay, because this is a kind of constraint that is a column constraint, you cannot define it as a column constraint. So you see that here in this case, this example, the name attribute is defined as not null, not null value. That means we have imported a not null constraint. So not null constraint will always be defined like that only. इसी तरीके से आप डिफाइन करेंगे, कॉलम के सामने ही डेफिनेशन जब आप कर रहे हैं तब तो डेटा टाइप के बाद आप लिख देंगे नॉट नल. Okay. Let's come back. Now, similarly, default constraint will be also defined like this constraint not null. That means if you want to define a default value for a particular column, you have to give that default constraint with the column definition itself. Okay. Okay, all this. Okay, so suppose that value, so you can specify default and a space like this. So you can define default 40,000. So now when you will skip this value, you don't provide this value, database will automatically accept this value, will store this value. Okay, let me remove it from here. I don't want to modify. Okay. So this is default value constraint is always defined as column constraint. Okay. Now there are some constraints that can be defined as both. Either you can define them table constraint or column constraints, like primary key constraint. So primary key constraint can be defined as column constraint or table constraint. When you have a single column as a key, as a primary key, you can define it either as a column constraint or as a table constraint. Okay, but when your primary key is composite one, you have to define it as a table constraint. So table constraint का मतलब after the definition of the column, you will specify the key. Okay, jab when you have defined, you have completed the definition of the columns, you can give the definition of the primary key as a, and it will be called as table constraint. Similarly, unique constraint. Unique constraint can be defined as both table constraint and column constraint. Similar to the primary key. When your unique constraint, a unique constraint is a constraint that is having single attribute, okay, then you can define it as a column constraint. But when you have a unique constraint that is a kind of composite key, that is your candidate key is composite key, it includes two or more attributes, then you have to define it as a table constraint, similar to the primary key. We will see some example. Then check constraint. So similarly to the check constraint, you can, it is up to you, you can define it as a column constraint or as a table constraint. Okay. Foreign key constraint. Foreign key constraint can also be defined as table constraint or column constraint. When foreign key contains only one attributes reference key, then you can define it as a कॉलम कंस्ट्रेंट. दैट मींस फॉरेन की का जो कॉलम है, जिस कॉलम को रेफरेंस कर रहा है वो एक सिंगल एट्रीब्यूट की है, देन यू कैन डिफाइन इट एज ए कॉलम कंस्ट्रेंट. व्हेन योर फॉरेन की the reference key corresponding to foreign key is composite, you have to define it as a column constraint, table constraint. Okay. Let's see some example of all these that we have discussed. So as I told you that unique constraints, the purpose of unique constraint is that if you want to define that this column should be, the value in this column should be always unique, you can define unique constraint. So so suppose that you have this definition of the table, id, you have id which is integer type, and you specify that id is not null. Then you have last name which is varchar 25, you want that last name should be not null, so you have specified not null constraint. First name, it is varchar, and you want to define a constraint. Okay, so this is how you define unique constraint. Constraint is the keyword. Okay, however these keywords are optional, so this part is optional actually. Constraint and name of the constraint. Unique key is this is the way that you can define unique key. Unique id comma last name. What you want, id comma last name should always be unique, so you can write unique id comma last name. Okay, now suppose that your unique key includes only single column, then you can just write unique. For example, suppose last name, you want that this should be unique, then you can just write last name varchar 255 and then you will write keyword unique. Similar to the primary key, you will write unique only, unique key nahi likhna hai, unique, and you are done. Now let me tell you what is this syntax. Many times what may happen that you may would like to give some name to the constraints. Okay, and suppose you want to give a name to the primary key, so that जरूरत पड़ने पर आप उसे name से refer करें, or you would like to manipulate that through program, or later you want to modify that key, or you want to access that key with the name. Okay, so if you don't give you the name, generally that as we have seen that in earlier definitions, we have not given name to the key. For example, in this table we have defined a primary key, we have not given any name to this key. Okay, so when you don't want to give name to a key, you can define key in this way. Now when you don't give name to the key, MySQL automatically creates a name for the key that you have given. So every key is given a name. MySQL gives every key is some name, especially for table constraints. Okay, and agar you want to give the name of your choice, you can also give with the help of the syntax like this. Constraint, this is the keyword that you need to provide, and then name of the constraint, जो भी आपको नाम रखना है. So I just wanted that UC underscore person should be given to this unique constraint name. Okay, so now whenever you want to modify this with the help of alter table, you can refer this constraint with this name. जरूरत पड़ने पर आप इस name से इसको कॉल करके मॉडिफाई कर सकते हो। ओके, दिस इज द एडवांटेज ऑफ द गिविंग नेम ऑफ योर चॉइस। ठीक है, आप अपनी चॉइस का नाम नहीं देंगे, देन माइस्कल अपने चॉइस का नाम देगा, दैट मे बी वेरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड फॉर यू टू रिमेंबर। ओके, एनी क्वेश्चन? एनी क्वेश्चन? Okay, I believe no question is there. Now there is also another way. The same thing can be done in this way also. For example, ID int not null, last name varchar 255 not null, first name varchar 255, age int, and unique ID. Now here you are just defining ID attribute as a unique attribute. Now in place of this also you could have written unique here, not null unique, or unique not null. यहाँ भी लिख सकते थे. So same thing will be done. Okay, so you have the choice. Either you can define key in this way when you have only one attribute as the key. So we are assuming that ID is the unique. Okay, so you can define unique ID in this way, or you can put unique constraint on ID column in this way, or you can just write a ID int unique and specify not null. So now you know that when we specify unique key, if not null constraint is also added with the unique key, it will behave like primary key. However, it will not be called primary key, but it will behave like primary key, because primary key have two things. It have unique values, so unique constraint is automatically there, and it also have not null constraint. So both constraints are combined to make the primary key. Okay, लेकिन याद रखना, अगर किसी तो ऐसा नहीं है, अगर it will become primary key, it will not be treated as a primary key. However, it will have all the properties of the primary key. Okay, now one more thing, you can have more than one unique key on a table, but you can have only one primary key on a table. It should be remember, it is very important. You should remember that you can have only one primary key on a table, but you can have more than one unique key. Got it? I think it is clear to everyone. Now this is the example that show you id int not null unique. Order is not important, unique को आप पहले भी लिख सकते थे. Okay, so this is the same way to doing this thing. So all these three definitions are actually equivalent. यूनिक कंस्ट्रेंट को आप ऐसे डिफाइन कर सकते हो जहाँ पे ये इट इज अ कंपोजिट है वन एक्चुअली, लेकिन आपके यूनिक कंस्ट्रेंट में एक ही कॉलम है, देन यू कैन आइदर डिफाइन इन दिस वे और इन दिस वे. ठीक है, so I have already told that it cannot contain null value. Now we all can also give name to the primary key. Okay, so in order to give the name to the primary key, so suppose we are defining the table here, that is table name is person varchar 255, and we are imposing not null constraint on this, then first name varchar 255. Okay, then we are imposing that this id should work as a primary key. Now one thing is that you can define id int primary key. This is also one way to define primary key, but now suppose I am willing to give name to the primary key, so you have to define this way. So I have written this thing into bracket because this part is optional.